welcome to today's podcast. I'm Granny Rhea.
And I'm Auntie Donia.
And we're here to talk about super special kids and cake. Yes, cake!
We're coming to you from the studios of Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. This podcast is brought to you by our book, Let's Talk, Social Communicative Services and Supports for Your Young Child with ASD, published by Paul H. Brooks and available from Amazon.
So what's our super special topic of the week?
Well, today we thought we would talk about inclusion. Inclusion means having super special kids placed in typical classrooms for part of the school day or all of the school day. You know, Auntie Donia, a lot of parents I've worked with really want their kids included. They feel it's important for the kids to have access to typically developing peers. They feel that the environment is going to be more stimulating for their super special child. And I certainly understand that impulse. But I've had a lot of experiences in different kinds of educational settings, and I come away from those experiences feeling like there are really a range of options that can be good for kids.
And I'd like to add a word just before inclusion, and I'd like to add the word meaningful, because we want to make sure that when we consider inclusion, that it's a meaningful experience for the super special kid, and that the teachers and the facilities are appropriate to meet their needs too.
That's so true, because just sitting a kid in a typical classroom is not going to do anybody any good. And I've been in classrooms where the super special kid has an individual aide, and they're in the classroom, but they're not of it. They don't participate. The aide spends all her time working with the super special child, doesn't include them in any activities with the peers, and it's almost like a little school within the school. And that's not what we should be seeing when we're really talking about inclusion. So I think we want to think about a range of models.
I think so too. And it could be that the super special kid spends part of the day in their super special classroom. So we sometimes refer to that as a self-contained classroom where their friends are other super special kids, and that they're with the other typical children, perhaps during playtime or during lunchtime.
Or during science, as we've discussed, there can be certain lessons that can be adapted for the super special child so that they can take advantage of them. But also, I'd like to urge parents to consider that sometimes the neighborhood school or the mainstream classroom is really not the best place for their child to be. We here at Sacred Heart, we work very closely with the Cooperative Educational Services, which offer regional programs for super special kids. And these schools are wonderful places. The classes are all very small. The resources are very high because they get equipment that's just appropriate for the super special kids, and they don't have to spend a lot of money on materials that the typical kids would be using. And these kids get a wonderful education. The people who are at this special school really want to be with super special kids all day long. They're trained that way. They get special professional development. So a lot of really good things can happen at schools that are more exclusive, if you will.
I've had that same experience too, Granny Rhea. I had helped set up a school in Cairo where the children were initially in mainstream inclusion schools and really were not having successful experiences. And as you said, we set up smaller classrooms, the staff were trained to do the work, and some of those super special kids also had physical limitations as well. And their physical limitations seemed so much bigger in the mainstream school, whereas once they were in this environment that was set up for them, they were so much more independent.
Yeah, that's really true because as we were talking about the aides, very often when a student has an aide in a mainstream school, the aide just does everything for them. And, you know, aides are wonderful people and they work very hard and often they're very, very attached to their super special student, but they're not very highly trained. Many of them only have a high school degree. They've never had any specialized training to work with super special kids or to be teachers for that matter. And so they often don't know how to bridge the distance between the super special child and the other children in the classroom. So without specialized training and a lot of professional support, sometimes they can't provide as rich an environment for a super special child as a really specialized school can.
And I think sometimes with our super special kids, the academics is not really, it's not going to be necessarily their strength. So we want them perhaps to develop some everyday skills, literacy skills, perhaps some numeracy skills. But sometimes our super special kids need to focus on more adaptive living skills. So learning how to dress themselves, to feed themselves, to develop a range of interests, and later on to have some kind of vocational training. And within the regular mainstream educational setting, you can't do those things. It's very difficult to set up the adaptive training, which is something that when these super special kids grow up to be super special adults, these become essential life skills for them.
That's absolutely true, and that is something that sometimes a specialized school can do better. On the other hand, there are some really good inclusive programs as well, and I think you've been working with one of them, Auntie Donia.
That's right. I work with the ASD Nest program, which is a New York City public school program, which is a wonderful inclusion program for high-functioning students with autism. And there are usually 4 to 5 students with autism in the classroom with neurotypical children. And the model is very unique because you always have 2 teachers. So you always have a special educator and a general educator in the classroom. The administration is extremely supportive of the model, so they allow time for collaboration, and you have a speech and language pathologist and other specialists that come in and support the school teachers and the students as well. And I think that's very important, where the teachers are supported too.
Absolutely, Auntie Donia. And as I said earlier, just putting a child in a mainstream classroom is not an inclusion program. That's just warehousing. But if parents are committed to seeing their child in a mainstream classroom, I think one of the things they have to think about is how can they secure the support for the teachers and the other support personnel in the school to make this work well for the child and not just to be a pro forma solution. So we want always to think about what's the content of the program, not what's the name of the program.
And maybe going back to your question to ask yourself is, here are my child's strengths and needs. What is the best environment to support their needs?
Right, and certainly being with typical peers is important. There's no question about it. But there might be other ways to get to that point besides being in an inclusive program. For example, the child might join a Boy Scout troop, and if parents can provide a little support, the child can succeed in this sort of after school or extracurricular activity. Again, sometimes parents have to do a little extra work. I remember I worked with a family once that had a little girl quite severely impaired who was not ambulatory, nonverbal, but she went to Girl Scout camp every summer. And the Girl Scouts were very accommodating about making sure that there were things that she could do, and the other children were very welcoming. They'd been taught to accept this little girl, and she went to Girl Scout camp for 12 years
That's
until
lovely.
She was too old to go to Girl Scout camp.
And sometimes I think we can look into other community type settings, for example, local church or synagogue or mosque or temple, where they have activities that are for families, and that can be a really lovely place as well, where it is inclusive, and you can explain to the people there that you have a super special kid, if that's something that's comfortable to you. And usually people will be very accommodating to that.
Yeah, and it's also, it's a way to support your super special child's interests. If the child has a particular interest, you can even help to create a little peer group around it. Perhaps your super special child loves to play checkers. Well, maybe you can get a few other kids who like to play checkers and get them someplace to meet after school and play checkers one afternoon a week.
So really, we want you to think about what is meaningful inclusion, and accordingly with your team to come to the best decision or agreement. So, Granny Rhea, let's see what one of our listeners has sent us for today's super special question.
What's our super special question for today, Auntie Donia?
So this was asked by a mother, and she said, what does she do when her child engages in perseverative play? And besides following her child's lead, do we have any other strategies that we would recommend for her child to let either herself or peers into his play?
Well, it kind of depends on the child's age, doesn't it, and what that routinized play is. But let's start with kind of a simple answer, and that is that when a child is stuck in something and has, for instance, a special interest or a special activity, I think what we want to think about doing is expanding what they are already interested in. Rather than trying to draw them away from it, I think we want to think about how can I seek into that? How can I join his world and open it up a little bit so that he comes into mine? So, for example, I once worked with a family where the child, this was a really little child, but what she liked to do was flip the light switch on and off, which of course drives everybody crazy because the lights go out, nobody can see anything. So it was really annoying. So what we worked with the mother to encourage was to have the mother follow the child when she goes to the light switch, let her switch it off once, and then have her mother put her hand over the switch and not say anything, just put it there, wait, and see if the child will look at mom, maybe say something like no or light or something, use a sign, whatever, however the child communicates. And then after that has happened and the child has given some verbal or conventional signal, then the mom might remove her hand for a second, let the child flip the switch, and then flip it right back, flip the hand right back. So what we were trying to do is make it into a game.
Right.
So it's not that the child is just indulging in this sensory routine, but that there's a back and forth. And eventually what we tried to do was insert something within the routine so that something else was going on between the time mom took her hand off the switch and put it back on, so that the child would be engaged in something a little more adaptive after she'd had her chance to flip the switch, she and mom would do something together. Maybe they'd play patty cake or sing a favorite song, and then they'd go back to that game.
And I think with the example of flipping the switch, you want to move to an activity perhaps that gives the child the same stimulation, but perhaps of higher interest. So finding a game or a toy, like you said, that replaces that too. But I think the other thing, Granny Rhea, we want to remember is that typical children and adults like to follow routines and sometimes play with the same thing over and over again. I know last night when we were having dinner, we were talking about how we both like to watch certain movies over and over again. So I think remembering that that when children repeat the same game over and over again, it can also developmentally be something that we see in our typical children, because they're actually learning even sort of how something works and sort of deepening knowledge in a way.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it as a form of mastery, but many times what our super special kids are doing is not really getting them very much. So although it's natural and normal to want to engage in these routines, I still think we want to open them up to other people so other people can join them.
And that's where sort of as parents or caregivers, when you're observing and seeing how long your child is playing with something and that repetition, as you said, we can then help them to open them up to other ideas. I know there was a super special older kid I was working with, and his interest was looking at different trains and subways. And he expanded his interest to look at trains from different countries, to look at the different speeds of different trains, and even to look at, he was actually very interested in old trains as well, which was quite interesting too. So that was something that him and his family, they used to look at the different picture books of these different trains.
And was that expansion something he did spontaneously on his own, Auntie Donia, or was he encouraged by
No, he
other
was
people?
encouraged. And he was encouraged in a way that they very naturally introduced it. So he had his picture book that he always looked at. And then one day his dad came with a stack of new pictures of trains and just gently introduced them without forcing him. And then that was something where rather than it being perseverative, it increased his interest a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think we talked in an earlier podcast about this idea, bringing this idea into the school, where if the child has special interests or even repetitive routines that they like to do, figuring out ways to open them out into the curriculum. So, for example, if the child is really interested in running around the playground repeatedly during recess instead of playing with other children, maybe the teacher can start a running club where children who elect to do so can run around the field to gain miles or steps and win prizes for achieving certain levels. So those are the kinds of strategies I think we want to try to think about to take a behavior that might look odd or maladaptive in and of itself and figure out how to merge it in with a normal routine.
And I think as one last strategy, Granny Rhea, I would also encourage families to remove the item that the child is constantly playing with. I mean, if it's always available and you don't have anything else available, I mean, if you remove, this happened with a child who was an older child, an 8-9-year-old, who was always playing with the same Peppa Pig. And once we removed Peppa and there were other toys and games available, he was then interested in these other toys. But if you don't make them available and you say, oh, well, he's never going to play with anything else.
Sure. Although sometimes children might become upset if their favorite toy is not available. So we can just remove it for short periods of time and encourage the child to play for 5 minutes with something until Peppa Pig comes back from his trip to the store. Is it a her or a he? I don't know.
Peppa's a girl.
Okay. Until Peppa comes back from her trip to the store. And when she comes back, then she will be able to play with the child again. And of course, we're going to gradually increase that interval until we hope the child will find other things that are fun to play with.
Sounds good.
Auntie Donia, there are so many myths and misconceptions in working with children with developmental disabilities. And some of them are so absurd, they just make us go, arghhh!
Granny Rhea, I know that our topic that makes us both go, arghhh, is a shared pet peeve for both of us. And it's when people speak about the child and the child is in front of them. So they think that because the child has an intellectual disability and they're a super special kid, that just because they don't necessarily understand what they're saying, that it's